First off, I wish Bilawira was here so I could thank her for her welcome to country, and I acknowledge the traditional Larrikey people as the owners of this land that we're meeting on today, and pay my respects to their ancestors past, present and into the future. I also want to thank her for asking that question about what about completions, because they matter, and so that's what my project is about. The other thing I'd like to say is that I am employed full-time as a researcher with the Northern Institute, so this was sort of my side project. So I have a lot of sympathy for all those part-time students that actually are juggling a whole lot of other things in their life with something else that they're quite passionate about. This research was funded by NESHE, so that's the National Centre for Student Equity in Higher Education, so I do thank them for allowing me to have a dip into this. Just a bit of terminology up front. I am using the term Indigenous, and that covers all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia. And I acknowledge that there's a big diversity in that population group, and it means no disrespect for them. It's particularly relevant because Central Queensland University have significant numbers of Torres Strait Islander students. I'm using HE for higher education study at the university level, so this study is actually focusing on students enrolled in a bachelor degree only. Now I'm going to be talking about award completions, and the definition that we use is just the completion of units that, when combined, satisfy the requirements for a HE degree award. Now that doesn't mean that somebody who enrolled to be a bachelor is not counted as a completion if they actually exit university with a diploma. So it is covering that as a completion. But it isn't going the other way, so if you start off in HE and end up transferring to VET. So that's something that I'll talk about later. Attrition is when a student drops out of their study before completion, or they just don't re-enroll in their study. It's treated slightly differently in some of the national data on students at the at the HE level. So it is sort of explicit to this study in how we're treating it. It's a database project, and I always feel as though I have to apologise for that. I'm a statistician, I'm throwing numbers at you. But today I'll also be dipping into some of that qualitative research that James and Kim were part of, because the Central Queensland University also was involved in that OLT study. And it's really important, numbers are very stark, and they certainly don't tell the whole story. So the nuance I think that this research is suggesting that we need in higher education policy is definitely about those experiences. So those personal experiences about higher education for them. So I'll be doing that as well. So I don't need to tell people, I don't think, in this room, why increasing Indigenous access, participation and achievement in HE is a major education priority. So we've got lots of research that suggests that access to greater education is linked to better benefits in terms of health, socioeconomic outcomes, and also poverty levels even. So we've got international research making that link. So we talked about the Berendt Review, the Bradley Report. So many of those big reports are at the background of this research that point to the importance of increasing participation and access for a number of equity groups, but the Indigenous peoples particularly. With the Berendt Review being seminal, and I just make this quote, that achieving parity in enrolments, retention and completions across a broad spread of disciplines will tell us not only that the choice to participate in higher education is the norm for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but also that the higher education system is supporting their success. So Indigenous higher education students from regional and remote areas are actually a group that is even more underrepresented even within the broader Indigenous student body. And that's backed up with research by James, who used results from the whole of community engagement, also with the ABS, National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Survey, and also Louise Pollard's work more generally, not just looking at Indigenous students, but finding those students from remote areas face very significant barriers in terms of access and participation. And as James was mentioned as well, there's the cumulative impact of belonging to multiple equity groups. And he's got evidence in his research as a fellow last year, looking at what will strengthen evaluation in Indigenous higher education in Australia, but also draws on early work by Anderson and al. In 2008, who pointed to the role of the universities in releasing collective Indigenous people's potential, and looking at all those socio-economic barriers, discrimination and stigma, and being first in family, that are addressed by the Indigenous population. So this research is really trying to figure out, using a database, so using statistics, on what helps. But that's going to be nuanced by looking at the reasons why some of those numbers appear. Because we all have to always remember that those numbers in these studies are actually people at the other end. A very brief context to show you an overview of funding, and you probably all know this as well, but my cohort study begins from 2002. So just to tell you that in Australia, it's the Commonwealth Government that has the major funding responsibility for higher education under the Higher Education Support Act. Obviously, through this whole time, students were also contributing to their study through HECS and then HELP. But one of the major reforms was when the Commonwealth uncapped those places, and that happened from 2012. So my cohorts did cross that era, and it certainly impacted a couple of years before when there was a releasing of that minimum 5% to 10%. So we can see that student numbers are probably going to increase from there. So we've got this demand-driven funding introduced from 2012, which opened up places to people. Now that was effectively ended at the end of 2017, and I know that the current Commonwealth Government is actively exploring ways that HE funding can be tied to student success. And I think that what they really mean is student completions in that space. So this research is important. The other context in terms of Indigenous support is obviously the AB study, that's social payments provided to identified Indigenous students. Away from BASE, which is funding to assist contact between lecturers and students. Commonwealth scholarships, which are administered by the universities themselves, and a range of other scholarships that are presented, so philanthropic, industry, land councils, and other government or industry-specific scholarships. So we've got a very complex funding basis there and background. Some of these departments are not the one department, so we've got DHS, we've got DSS, and we've got PM&C with their Indigenous affairs portfolio funding some of this. So just, trying to navigate through that whole space is pretty complex and exhausting. In terms of the context, so I'm introducing both these universities, so I'm looking at CDU and Central Queensland University, because they are like. So James talked about the sorts of things and policies and practice that makes CDU unique, but CQU is operating in that space as well. So it seemed that it was good to bring those student data together, because that gives me a bigger data pool to play with. And all sorts of data research is hammered by the issue of small numbers. Both have high access and participation rates relative to other universities for Indigenous students. They've got student catchments, obviously, in regional and remote areas specifically, and they've got those long-standing commitments to higher education for Indigenous peoples. So my research was really using student data. And it's not great data. So it's data that's collected on enrolment, and it is updated in some ways through the process, tracking a student through their study. And making comparisons with respect to graduate completions, length of time that it takes to complete, and relative attrition over time. And in the wider report, I make those comparisons with the national Indigenous student population, but also make some comparisons with the non-Indigenous populations of both of those universities. So if we look at what cohort analysis can actually do, you sort of think, oh, well, completions, that's not really hard. You know, surely we can see how many Indigenous students end their year with an award. But when we try and put that in context of, okay, as a proportion of what, you know, what population group, it gets really hard. And so that's why we use cohort analysis. So we're basically gathering up students who start their enrolment at the same time. So in this study, we've taken cohorts way back from 2005 through to cohorts that started in 2012. And as you can see, when I'm trying to observe them through their study process, then some cohorts are ending. They don't allow me to do that in 2012. Of course, I can only see them up to their fourth year, because I've only got data up to 2016. But some of the earlier cohorts allow me to track changes all the way up to 10 years. So what's happening? Are there students still there at the end of 10 years? And in 2005, it's 11 years. So I look at these observation points at times. So what's happening? I cut the data and I look at what's happening at the year 4 point, which is pretty much what we expect a full-time bachelor degree students to have finished by year 4. I'll have a look at 6-year time point, because there are some part-time students that have completed by then, particularly if they've only got 3 years of study and they're doing a 0.5 load. And then I'm taking it out to 10 years to see, okay, have we got students still engaged at that year point? But also, this cohort analysis also allows me to look at some of the student characteristics that might be impacting successful completion. And it allows me to identify those other equity groups. And so we're talking about before, what's unique about our Indigenous students here is that they are belonging to those multiple equity groups. And their remoteness, their non-English speaking background, their low socioeconomic status, their disability, their women studying in their sciences, engineering and maths subjects, and their first in family to attend university. Enrolment data doesn't actually align all that well to all of these groups, and it also relies on the actual process of enrolment and data collection to be of high quality. So we're expecting our students to identify their indigeneity, we're expecting them to identify their disability and whether they've got a non-English speaking background. And my research does suggest that potentially for some students they're not doing that. And when they see discrimination and disadvantage being attracted by some of these statuses, they may be less likely to identify them anyway, even if they have them. And we've got some research to say, particularly in the disability space, that Indigenous people are not likely to identify their disability and their indigeneity at the same time. So we've already got some complexities in our analysis. So this is just a profile of the Indigenous students that I've included in my study relative to, this is all domestic Australian students, and I know you probably can't see that at the back, but let me quickly summarise, if I can find my space. So, yeah, much more likely to be from regional and remote areas, 85% compared to 20% for the national cohort. Much more likely to come from low SES, so 37% compared to 17. Much more likely to be female, 73% compared to 59. Much less likely to be studying full-time. Much less likely to be studying internally, so only 33% of these students studying internally. Much more likely to be over the age of 58% compared to 19. So that pipeline that the universities in other parts of Australia rely on straight from school, that's not our cohort here. Identify with a disability, those numbers are so small, I haven't raised them, but there's only 4% nationally anyway. Identifying a non-English speaking background. So we've only got 5% of our Indigenous cohort identifying that. Now, that throws up some questions already. Are they just not participating? So we've got our remote communities here who we know have non-English speaking backgrounds. Are they not participating? Or is it the data collection, it's not well understood what that question actually means? Does it mean that they can't speak English? And it's used to identify international students or students of overseas parents or migrants to Australia. So, you know, there's a quandary about what the quality of that data item. They're much less likely to be admitted by a secondary school, so that's looking at the age thing. And they're much more likely as well to have participated in some sort of tertiary enabling course. Okay, so all I'm trying to do here is understand. And as I said, the numbers are stark, so that's why I'm dipping into that qualitative research that has been made available through the OLT study, also some other studies, and that's also from Queensland University, Central Queensland University as well. Because what we want to do is we wanted to continue to build the evidence base that was called on by the Bennett Review. We want more understanding of what's happening. And I'm certainly not saying that my numbers today are telling you the whole story. Okay? Okay, so in terms of just the numbers, we can see that that the cohorts were generally getting increased numbers over time. We're certainly looking at the effect of the demand-driven system, you know, so we've got open places here. This is when BITE no longer offered bachelor level degrees study to new students, is my understanding. So that's from there, and I think that a lot of that was the attraction of those students to CDU. Okay, so over time we're looking at increased numbers. It's 196% compared to 71% of Indigenous students nationally over that same time period. Whoa. Oh, sorry. We've also got, generally, when we're looking at comparisons between the national Indigenous student population and the ones at CDU, CQU, that they have got lower completion rates. Okay, so this graph is at 4 years compared to at 6 years and at that 10-year observation point. Okay, so we've got lower completion rates relative. However, they are increasing their completion over time. So the way that people are gathering the numbers, gathering completion over time, is very similar across both cohorts. There's higher levels of attrition, so if you look at that red bar, that's the attrition, so there is greater attrition of students CDU, CQU. But very similar levels of persistence in terms of their continuing engagement in study. So we've got this attrition, but these guys are still hanging on. So they're still enrolled. They're still enrolled, they're still enrolled. And there's actually slightly more CDU, CQU, 6% compared to the 5%. Woo.
Just pull it down.
Just Can someone do that for me?
Go to the next slide, I think.
Okay. Yeah, so now I've stuffed it up. I'm sorry. Stuffed it up. Button. Escape. Escape, escape. It's terrible. I can't even find escape. There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so that tells us a broad picture in comparison to nationally. So let's just look at this cohort. What I've done, you know, like I'm throughout the project I have problems with small numbers. So what I've done with my cohorts, I can't look at them all over time. So I'm taking the average at the end of 6 years. So I'm saying I'm looking at all my cohorts, and at the 6-year point, I'm taking the average across them. And so that's what this next bit is based on. So on average, 28% of Indigenous students have successfully completed their award at that 6-year observation point. Okay? So let's have a look at both personal and study characteristics that are impacting those completion rates. Okay, so students from regional areas achieve higher completion rates compared to remote, but also compared to metro. So that's interesting. Okay, so regionally, we've got a lot of regional students, and yes, lots of evidence suggests that students in remote areas are having much more significant barriers to participation and support. Metro, I'd suggest that both campuses, all of those are online, so they're external students. So that's telling us something as well. Just looking at a quote, I was disengaged from uni. I wasn't really aware of the services. I just felt isolated. And when you look at that remote, the studies looking at remote and students studying from remote areas, it's just that feeling of isolation and that access to support and services that they're not getting. Low socioeconomic areas achieved higher completion rates compared to medium and high. But as you see, most of our students are from low socioeconomic areas. So that's not the big potential disadvantage, or maybe it's a problem with the indicator, which is based on TIFA. That's an area-based indicator, and sometimes I think it's a bit rubbish. But it doesn't mean that financial support is not a really big enabler of participation and completion. So these quotes are just pointing straight to that. I pulled out many times because of money problems, you know, that she's trying to support just herself but also her family on that money. For me, return to study would be, I have to be financially better off to participate. And one of the biggest challenges for me was financial. I got that little bit of ab study, but because I was working, it wasn't much. So scholarships are helping. Unfortunately, with my analysis, I can only look at the impact of Commonwealth scholarships, and so we've got a fairly small number of students that have Commonwealth scholarships, but they're much more likely to complete. So, quote directly, the other important thing for me is getting an Indigenous scholarship, okay? Not just getting it, but understanding what it means to them in terms of their obligation to use that money and return that to community as well. Okay, women, much more likely to complete than men. Look at that. Sorry, blokes, what are you doing? But that's because we've got lots more women participating in higher education. So where are the men? And they're probably in vet. And this, it doesn't allow us, we're a dual sector university, and this analysis does not allow us to look at transfers from HE to vet, so that other way, so we're all talking about pathways from vet to university, but perhaps we also need to look at it in the opposite direction as well, to actually make dual sector meaningful for everybody who's engaging in post-school study. Again, students over 35 from CDU and CQU are actually more likely to complete even than these ones that come straight from school. Okay? So they're coming. So that's actually really interesting. They're a mature set of students. Okay? They have, at that point, still lots of family and social obligations, but potentially this is also telling us that Indigenous peoples actually have those increased obligations and commitments at a much earlier life point, and maybe by the time they're 35, they've actually got some relief from that. Don't know. This needs some further investigation. Students from non-English speaking backgrounds are less likely to complete, and perhaps that makes sense. Okay, when we're talking about the sort of academic in English environment that surrounds universities. But it's really interesting when we look at national cohort studies, people from non-English speaking backgrounds actually have higher completion rates. So they're actually more likely to complete than others. So what's going on? What's the problem here? Is it about access to those sorts of supports, so those wraparound services that is really taking and teaching or preparing students with the English that they'll need to converse in while they're at university study? Have I got 2 minutes? Gosh. Multimode. I think that this is a really interesting one as well. So multimode way out here as students studying through multimode. So that's not studying internally. So all the other studies suggest that people who study internally are the ones that complete at a higher rate. But their study, multimode is studying, is helping students complete at higher than internally, and both are higher than external. Okay? So we have to look at what is it about these multi-mode designs that are helping our students complete. That's actually really interesting, because maybe it's helping those remote people, you know, have confidence in their own environment, but bringing them in for the importance of that face-to-face, getting those relationships, getting that peer support, knowing their lecturer and stuff. So maybe that's important but they're still allowed to study in their home environments. And these are a whole lot of quotes, and I know that I can't go through them with them, but it's picking up some of those things that distance is hard. You know, you haven't got that face-to-face, and there's a lot of students that want that face-to-face, but they also want, you know, all that accessibility that's provided by studying online means we've got to balance both. How do you do it? And maybe it's multi-mode that's doing it well. Teaching and nursing are the ones that are the highest likelihood, and maybe they're the ones doing multi-mode. Don't know. Obviously, full-time, part-time, this makes sense, okay? Part-time at the end of 6 years, maybe like most of those students haven't had the opportunity to complete. So, but, you know, the opportunity to actually go and study full-time is not afforded to the Indigenous population, particularly when they're older and they have those multiple commitments. It's just so intense, this student says, because all that external stuff is so important to her and why she's studying in the first place. And then we've got all this range of commitments in terms of looking after family, but cultural commitments as well, that have to be balanced when somebody is studying. Students are admitted based on previous HE, so they're not admitted based on secondary school study on average here. So what's that telling us? And I think it's telling us that our Indigenous students are dipping in and out of study, potentially over a much longer period of time as well. And we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to think about ways to support that or help people come back to study when they dip out, if we want them to succeed. And the other one is that students who had participated in any prior enabling course are completing at lower rates than those who don't. Now, there's lots of research that says, you know, enabling courses are the thing that helps release that academic potential of students. But they are academically probably the most vulnerable as well, which is potentially what this data is saying. And we need to think about the ways to support them through to success. Okay, so in a nutshell, these results, and these are only just a small sort of highlight of the report, but we know remoteness impacts, but it's not just completion, it is participation in the first place. Gender impacts, but it's women that are completing or are participating in higher education, and they're completing as well. Being full-time helps, but for many that's just impossible considering their life stage and the circumstances, obligations, particularly cultural obligations and community responsibilities that they have to juggle. Being older does help, but as I said, it might point to the fact that Indigenous people go through their life course at different phases. So, you know, 35 and over might be when they're released a bit to have the opportunity to study. NESB appears to be negatively impacting completion, but it could also be those data issues that I talked about. Course design appears to be helping. What is it about multimode that is helping these students complete? I think that's something that we need to think about. Financial support does help, so scholarships are providing students with that choice to keep on studying. Pathways into HE and between HE and VET, as I talked about, are complicated. We need to be getting better and more savvy at that, particularly when we want to find our men in post-school study. And more research is needed around what works in that enabling space. So we can't just leave our students, once they've participated in an enabling course, and go, okay, off we go. So these are my conclusions. I know that I've run completely out of time, and I'm sorry because there's scones. But I think that the main thing here is that you can't look at that data in isolation of the qualitative narrative. And I've been able to dip into qualitative narrative that's been available. And that's really, really important if we're really going to understand what's going on. There's numbers of recommendations, which I will not bore you with. Lots of it is around data. But I think that one thing that this data tells us is that we've got to increase some of that national reporting timeframe to include those students who are still there at the end of 10 years engaged in study.